It's been 3 weeks since 18-year-old Anna Keaptainner was found dead aboard the Carnival Horizon cruise ship, and the world is still asking why no one has been arrested. What was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation in the crystal blue waters of the Caribbean turned into an unimaginable tragedy that has left more questions than answers. A young woman with her entire life ahead of her, dreams of college, a career, a future, gone in an instant. And the most haunting part? The person responsible might be closer to home than anyone wants to admit. New evidence is emerging every single day. Forensic details that paint a disturbing picture, family testimonies that don't quite add up, and a timeline that keeps shifting like sand beneath our feet. But the truth still remains elusive. Hidden beneath layers of family loyalty, contradictory statements, in a justice system that seems paralyzed by the complexity of what happened that night. So let me ask you something. Who killed Anna Keaptainner? That's the question we're going to answer together over the next few minutes. Now, before we dive deeper into the night of the murder, I want you to understand something important. This case isn't just about finding out who killed Anna Keaptainner, though that's obviously crucial. This case is also about lessons we can all learn, warning signs we should never ignore, and protective measures we can take to keep our own loved ones safe. Because as we unravel this mystery together, you're going to see red flags that were missed, opportunities for intervention that were overlooked, and family dynamics that enabled something horrific to happen. And if we can learn from Anna's tragedy, if we can take these lessons and apply them to our own lives, then maybe, just maybe, we can prevent another family from experiencing this kind of unimaginable loss. So stay with me. Pay attention to the details. Because by the end of this investigation, you'll understand not just what happened to Anna, but how to recognize danger before it's too late. We're going to dig deep into every piece of evidence, every family member's testimony, every forensic detail that's been uncovered so far. And before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that justice should be served for Anna, if you believe that her story deserves to be told and that someone needs to be held accountable, hit that subscribe button right now, because only trolls and manipulators won't subscribe to a channel fighting for truth and justice. Let's get into this case together. Picture this. November of 2020, a family setting sail on what should have been the vacation of a lifetime. Anna Keaptainner, just 18 years old, vibrant, full of life, boarding the Carnival Horizon with her father, her stepmother, her siblings, and her paternal grandparents. 7 days of Caribbean sunshine, endless buffets, tropical ports of call, and memories that should have lasted forever. The family was excited. You can see it in the photos from the first few days of the cruise. Anna smiling with her grandparents on the deck, the warm ocean breeze in her hair, her younger siblings playing in the ship's arcade, their faces lit up with joy. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. A blended family coming together, bonding over shared experiences, creating those precious moments that families treasure for years to come. But beneath that picture-perfect exterior, something dark was brewing. Something that would shatter this family forever and leave the world demanding answers. Because on November 6, 2005, just a few days into what was supposed to be a dream vacation, Anna Keaptainner would be found dead in her cabin, not from an accident, not from natural causes, but from asphyxiation. Someone had deliberately taken her life. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Her body had been carefully hidden beneath a mattress in the very cabin she shared with her family. The housekeeper who found her that morning will probably never forget the sight. A young woman's life extinguished, her body concealed as if someone hoped she simply wouldn't be discovered. As if whoever did this thought they could just sail away and pretend nothing had happened. But they couldn't. And now, 3 weeks later, as investigators piece together what happened that night, a disturbing pattern is emerging. A pattern that points to someone Anna trusted, someone who was supposed to protect her, someone who had access to her at the most vulnerable moment. Let's talk about the night of November 6, 2025, the night everything changed. The family had gathered for dinner that evening, one of those massive cruise ship buffets where you can eat until you can't move and then somehow find room for dessert. Anna was there with her grandparents, her father, her stepmother, and her siblings, including her 16-year-old stepbrother. According to her grandmother's testimony, Anna seemed a little off during dinner. Not quite herself, maybe feeling a bit under the weather. Nothing alarming, just that vague discomfort we all experience sometimes when our body's telling us something isn't quite right. She excused herself from the table and told her grandparents she was going to head back to the cabin to rest for a bit. "I'm just going to lie down for a while," she said, giving her grandmother a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine." Her grandparents didn't think much of it. Anna was a responsible young woman, mature for her age, perfectly capable of taking care of herself. They finished their dinner and made plans to meet up later at the ship's casino for some evening entertainment. Just another normal night on a cruise ship, or so they thought. But here's where the timeline gets interesting, and where we start to see the first cracks in the official story. About an hour later, Anna reappeared. On the webdom. She changed out of her dinner clothes and was now dressed up, looking beautiful and ready for a night out on the ship. According to her grandparents, she seemed to be feeling much better. Whatever had been bothering her at dinner had apparently passed. "Mima, I love you guys," she said to her grandmother, using that affectionate nickname that makes this whole story even more heartbreaking. "I'll see you later." Those were the last words Anna's grandmother would ever hear from her beloved granddaughter. "I love you guys. I'll see you later." Take a moment to let that sink in. Can you imagine being Anna's grandmother, replaying those words over and over in your mind, wondering if there was something, anything, you could have done differently? If you believe in finding the truth for Anna, hit that like button right now, because only trolls won't support the search for justice in this case. So Anna left her grandparents, presumably heading to the casino or to meet up with friends or just to enjoy the evening on the ship. She was 18 years old, on vacation, feeling better after a brief spell of discomfort. She had every reason to expect the night would end with laughter and fun, but she never made it to the casino. She never met up with her grandparents again. And as the hours ticked by and Anna didn't show up, her family started to worry. At first, it was just mild concern. Maybe she'd run into friends. Maybe she'd gotten caught up in one of the ship's shows. Maybe she'd simply lost track of time. But as midnight approached and there was still no sign of Anna, that concern turned into genuine alarm. Her grandparents started searching the ship, checking all the places they thought she might be. The casino, the various lounges, the deck areas where young people often gathered. Nothing. Anna had seemingly vanished into thin air. And here's where things take a dark turn. Because while her family was frantically searching the public areas of the ship, something unspeakable was happening in the privacy of their cabin. The Carnival Horizon, like all modern cruise ships, is equipped with extensive security systems, CCTV cameras in hallways, electronic keycard logs that track every entry and exit from every cabin. These systems exist for passenger safety, to prevent theft, to monitor who's going where at all times. And in the case of Anna Keaptainner, these systems would prove to be absolutely crucial in understanding what happened that night. Because the keycard logs told a very specific story, a story that would focus the investigation on one particular individual. According to those electronic records, only one person entered and exited Anna's cabin during the critical window when she disappeared. Not a stranger, not a random ship employee, not some outside intruder. The only person whose keycard accessed that cabin between the time Anna was last seen alive and when her body was discovered was her 16-year-old stepbrother. Let that sink in for a moment. The CCTV footage corroborated what the keycard logs showed. There he was, entering the cabin, staying inside for a significant period of time, and then leaving again, alone. No one else went in, no one else came out. Just him. Now you might be thinking, okay, but they shared a cabin, right? Family members on a cruise often share rooms to save money. Maybe he just went back to get something, to change clothes, to use the bathroom. Maybe his presence in the cabin was completely innocent. And that's exactly what some members of the family wanted to believe at first, because the alternative was too horrific to contemplate. But here's the thing about investigations. They don't rely on what we want to believe or what makes us comfortable. They rely on evidence. And as investigators began to piece together the evidence from that night, a disturbing picture started to emerge. A picture of a young woman who returned to her cabin feeling unwell, who was vulnerable and alone, and who encountered someone who should have protected her, but instead became the last person she would ever see. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about family dynamics in criminal investigations, because this is one of those lessons I mentioned earlier, something crucial that we all need to understand. When a crime occurs within a family, the natural human instinct is to protect our own. It's hardwired into us. We defend our children, our siblings, our relatives, even when the evidence suggests we shouldn't. We make excuses. We rationalize behavior. We convince ourselves that what we're seeing can't possibly be what's actually happening. And in many cases, this instinct to protect ends up protecting the wrong person while abandoning the actual victim. In Anna's case, we're going to see this dynamic play out in real time as we examine the family's testimonies and their responses to the mounting evidence. But before we get there, we need to understand exactly what the investigation uncovered in that cabin. Share this video if you think the truth needs to come out, because only manipulators would want to keep this story hidden. The morning of November 7th, 2025, less than 12 hours after Anna had last been seen alive, a housekeeper entered the cabin to perform routine cleaning services. What she found would haunt her forever. The cabin appeared relatively normal at first glance. Typical teenage mess, clothes scattered around, luggage in various states of unpacking. But something was off. The mattress on one of the beds seemed oddly positioned, lifted slightly as if something had been pushed underneath. And when the housekeeper looked closer, when she bent down to investigate, she saw a glimpse of fabric that didn't belong. A blanket, perhaps, or clothing that had fallen behind the bed. But as she pulled back the mattress to retrieve whatever had been wedged underneath, she discovered the unthinkable. Anna Keaptainner's body, carefully concealed, hidden from view, as if someone had desperately hoped she wouldn't be found until the ship had reached port. Or maybe not at all. The housekeeper's screams brought ship security running, and within minutes the cabin was sealed off as a crime scene. The ship's medical team arrived, then the security officers, and eventually, as protocol demanded for a death at sea, the FBI was notified that they would need to investigate a suspicious death aboard a U.S.-flagged vessel in international waters. But before the FBI could even arrive, before investigators could begin processing the scene, there was the matter of the initial examination. What had killed this vibrant 18-year-old woman? The ship's medical officer conducted a preliminary examination right there in the cabin, and what he found would set the direction for the entire investigation that followed. Anna had died from asphyxiation. She'd been deprived of oxygen until her body simply couldn't survive anymore. This wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a stroke. It wasn't some undiagnosed medical condition that had suddenly claimed her life. This was deliberate. This was murder. And whoever had done this had gone to great lengths to hide the evidence, to conceal her body, to buy themselves time. But buy time for what? To escape? To create an alibi? To convince the family that she had simply gone overboard or wandered off somewhere? Here's what made the crime scene even more perplexing and even more sinister. Anna's body showed no signs of sexual assault, which immediately ruled out certain common motives in cases involving young women. There were no controlled substances in her system, no drugs, no alcohol beyond what would be typical for someone her age on vacation. She hadn't been poisoned, she hadn't been beaten. There were no obvious defensive wounds that would suggest a prolonged struggle. In fact, according to the preliminary examination, Anna's body was in what investigators described as pristine condition, except for the fact that she was dead. But here's what didn't add up. Why was Anna undressed? Why was her body positioned the way it was, hidden so carefully beneath that mattress? Why were there life jackets involved in the concealment, along with blankets carefully folded around her? This wasn't a crime of passion where someone lashed out in a moment of rage and then panicked. This was methodical, calculated, almost clinical in its execution. Someone had taken the time to stage this scene, to think through how to hide what they'd done. And that tells us something crucial about the person responsible. They were thinking clearly enough to try to cover their tracks, which means this wasn't some accident or unintentional death. This was planned, or at the very least, the cover-up was planned immediately after the act. Notice how the crime scene is staged. This is a method often used to mislead investigations, to create confusion about what actually happened. And this brings up an important lesson that I want you to remember. Never assume that a crime scene is as simple as it seems. Always dig deeper. Always question the obvious explanation, because the truth is often hidden in the details that don't quite fit the narrative. Comment justice for Anna if you think her story deserves to be told, because only haters would want this case to be forgotten. Now let's talk about the forensic evidence that emerged in the days and weeks following Anna's death. Because while the initial crime scene told one story, the detailed forensic analysis would reveal layers of evidence that investigators couldn't ignore. First, there was the matter of DNA evidence. In any crime scene involving physical contact, and asphyxiation almost always involves physical contact, there's going to be a transfer of biological material between the victim and the perpetrator. Skin cells, hair follicles, traces of saliva, epithelial cells that slough off when hands make contact with skin. Modern forensic science has become incredibly sophisticated at detecting and analyzing even the smallest amounts of DNA. And in Anna's case, investigators found several crucial samples. There was DNA on the life jackets that had been used to help conceal her body. Not just Anna's DNA, which would be expected, but someone else's as well. There was DNA in the folds of the blanket that had been wrapped around her. And most tellingly, there was DNA found under Anna's fingernails. Evidence that she had made physical contact with someone shortly before her death. Perhaps she had grabbed at someone's arms or hands as she struggled to breathe. Perhaps she had clawed at someone's face or chest in those desperate final moments. Whatever the case, that DNA under her fingernails would prove to be a critical piece of evidence in identifying who had been in that cabin with her. But we'll come back to that in a moment, because there's another aspect of the forensic evidence that we need to discuss. The autopsy that was conducted once Anna's body was transported off the ship into a proper medical examiner's facility revealed additional details that help narrow down the timeline and method of death. Asphyxiation can occur in several different ways. Strangulation with hands, strangulation with an object like a rope or cord, smothering with a pillow or plastic bag, or compression of the chest that prevents the lungs from expanding. In Anna's case, the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was most consistent with smothering. Something had been placed over her nose and mouth, preventing her from drawing breath. There were no ligature marks on her neck, no bruising consistent with manual strangulation, no crush injuries to her chest cavity, just the telltale signs of someone who had been deprived of oxygen for several minutes until her brain shut down and her heart stopped beating. And here's the thing about smothering someone. It requires sustained effort. It's not like in the movies where someone places a pillow over someone's face for 10 seconds and they're gone. In reality, smothering someone to death takes several minutes of continuous pressure, during which time the victim is going to fight back with everything they have, because the human survival instinct is incredibly powerful. You can't accidentally smother someone. You can't do it in a moment of passion and then claim I didn't realize what you were doing. This is a deliberate, sustained act that requires the perpetrator to consciously maintain pressure for long enough to kill another human being. Which brings us back to the question that was on everyone's mind from the moment Anna's body was discovered. Who would do this to her? And why? Let's talk about the stepbrother, because every piece of evidence, every timeline, every forensic detail keeps circling back to this one individual. The 16-year-old son of Anna's stepmother, a teenager who should have been protecting his stepsister, looking out for her, treating her like family. But instead, according to the evidence that investigators would uncover, he may have been the last person to see her alive and the first person to see her dead. Now, I want to be very careful here, because in any criminal investigation, we have to be mindful of not convicting someone in the court of public opinion before all the evidence has been presented. But we also have to be willing to look at the facts objectively and ask the hard questions, even when those questions make us uncomfortable. So let's look at what we know about the stepbrother's history and behavior in the months and years leading up to that fateful night on the Carnival Horizon. According to family members who have spoken to investigators, and some who have spoken to the media under condition of anonymity, the stepbrother had exhibited what they described as concerning behavior toward Anna for quite some time. We're talking about inappropriate comments, boundary violations, behavior that made Anna uncomfortable, but that she may have been too afraid or too uncertain to report. In blended families, these situations can be incredibly complicated because there's often pressure to get along, to make the new family dynamic work, to not rock the boat or cause conflict. Anna may have felt like she couldn't speak up about her stepbrother's behavior without creating tension between her father and her stepmother. She may have worried that her complaints wouldn't be taken seriously, or that she would be accused of trying to sabotage the family's attempts at unity. This is something we see all too often in cases involving family violence. The victim is silenced by their own desire not to cause problems, while the perpetrator's behavior is excused or minimized by relatives who don't want to acknowledge what's happening. And in the end, that silence can be deadly. If you believe someone needs to answer for Anna's death, subscribe right now, because only manipulators would want this story to disappear. Several of Anna's friends have told investigators that she had mentioned her stepbrother's behavior to them, describing how uncomfortable he made her feel at times. She talked about how he would find excuses to be alone with her, how he would make comments about her appearance that crossed the line from brotherly to inappropriate, how he seemed to have difficulty understanding or respecting personal boundaries. But Anna, being the mature and responsible young woman she was, tried to handle the situation on her own. She would avoid being alone with him when possible. She would deflect his inappropriate comments with humor or by changing the subject. She tried to maintain peace within the family while also protecting herself as best she could. But on that cruise ship, trapped in close quarters with nowhere to escape to, her usual coping mechanisms may not have been enough. And when she returned to the cabin that night, feeling unwell and vulnerable, she may have encountered a situation she couldn't deflect or avoid. Now, here's where the timeline becomes absolutely critical, and where the stepbrother's own statements start to fall apart under scrutiny. Initially, when questioned by ship security and later by FBI investigators, the stepbrother claimed to have no memory of what happened that night. Complete amnesia, a total blackout of the hours between dinner and the morning when Anna's body was discovered. This is a classic defense strategy in criminal cases. If you claim you don't remember, you can't be caught in a lie. You can't have your story contradicted by evidence. But here's the problem with claiming memory loss. It's very difficult to prove or disprove, and investigators are trained to be extremely skeptical of convenient amnesia, especially when that amnesia conveniently covers the exact time period when a murder occurred. Especially when the person claiming amnesia is also the only person who can be placed in the room with the victim during the relevant time frame. So investigators started digging deeper into the stepbrother's claims, looking for inconsistencies, for moments where his memory seemed to work just fine and other moments where it suddenly failed him. And what they found was a pattern of selective memory. He could remember certain details from that night very clearly, like what he had for dinner, what he was wearing, conversations he'd had with other family members. But when it came to the crucial hours when Anna disappeared, suddenly everything went blank. He was placed on a psychiatric hold after Anna's death, standard procedure when someone is claiming memory loss related to a potential crime, especially when that someone is a minor. Psychiatrists and psychologists evaluated him, looking for signs of genuine trauma-induced amnesia versus fabricated memory loss. And here's what they observed. During his evaluation, the stepbrother exhibited emotional responses that didn't quite match someone who was genuinely confused or distressed about missing memories. Instead, he showed signs of anxiety that seemed more consistent with someone who knew exactly what had happened but was afraid of the consequences. He had moments where he started to say something, then stopped himself. Moments where he seemed on the verge of breaking down and confessing, then pulled back at the last second. This is what investigators call guilty knowledge, when someone's behavior indicates they possess information about a crime that an innocent person wouldn't have. But let's talk about something really important here. When someone claims memory loss during a traumatic event, we have to investigate whether it's a genuine defense mechanism or a convenient excuse. The human brain is capable of dissociative amnesia in extreme circumstances. It's a protective mechanism that can occur when someone experiences or witnesses something so traumatic that their mind essentially blocks it out. But true dissociative amnesia usually involves the victim of trauma, not the perpetrator. And it typically resolves over time, with memories gradually returning as the person feels safe enough to process what happened. In the stepbrother's case, weeks after Anna's death, his memory hadn't returned. He maintained his claim of having no recollection of those critical hours. And that raised serious red flags for investigators, because it suggested that his amnesia might be more strategic than psychological. But let's look at the hard evidence, because ultimately, claims and counterclaims only get you so far in an investigation. What matters is what can be proven through physical evidence and documented facts. And the physical evidence in this case tells a very clear story, one that doesn't require memory or testimony to understand. The keycard logs, we've mentioned these before, but let's dive into exactly what they show. Every single time someone uses a keycard to enter a cruise ship cabin, the ship's security system logs the exact time, the exact card that was used, and the exact door that was accessed. This creates an indisputable timeline of who went where and when. And according to those logs, Anna's cabin was accessed by her keycard at approximately 8:47 p.m. on November 6th, consistent with when she told her grandparents she was going back to rest. Then, at 9:23 p.m., the stepbrother's keycard accessed the same cabin. He remained inside for approximately 47 minutes. This is determined by the fact that no other keycard access occurred during that time, meaning the door wasn't open from the inside. At 10:10 p.m., his keycard registered again, this time opening the door from the inside, meaning he was leaving the cabin. After that, there's no record of anyone entering the cabin until the housekeeper the next morning. Now, what's significant about this timeline? Remember, Anna was supposed to meet her grandparents at the casino. She told them she'd see them later that evening, but she never showed up, which means that sometime between 9:23 p.m., when her stepbrother entered the cabin, and 10:10 p.m. when he left, Anna Keaptainner died. 47 minutes, that's the window we're looking at. 47 minutes when the only two people in that cabin were Anna and her stepbrother, and only one of them walked out alive. Like this video, if you believe the evidence should speak for itself, because only those with something to hide would ignore this kind of timeline. But the keycard logs are just the beginning, because the ship's CCTV system captured something even more damning. The Carnival Horizon, like all modern cruise ships, has cameras positioned throughout the vessel, in hallways, at elevator banks, near stairwells, in public areas. These cameras don't cover every inch of the ship. Obviously, cabins are private, bathrooms are private, certain areas are camera-free for privacy reasons. But the hallways? The hallways are monitored 24/7. And the hallway outside Anna's cabin had a camera with a clear view of her door. So investigators were able to review footage from that night, and what they saw corroborated everything the keycard logs had already told them. At 9:23 p.m., the stepbrother approaches Anna's cabin door, uses his keycard, and enters. The hallway remains empty for the next 47 minutes. No one else approaches the door. No one else enters or exits. Then, at 10:10 p.m., the door opens and the stepbrother emerges. And here's what investigators noticed when they watched that footage. When he exits the cabin, his demeanor has changed. He's looking around nervously, checking to see if anyone is in the hallway. His body language suggests agitation, stress, possibly guilt. He doesn't head toward any of the public areas where the family was supposed to meet. Instead, he goes directly to a different part of the ship, to a quieter area where he can be alone. This behavioral evidence, combined with the timeline and the forensic evidence, created what investigators call a triangle of proof, 3 different types of evidence, most pointing to the same conclusion. But let's talk about the DNA evidence in more detail, because this is where the case against the stepbrother becomes even more compelling. Remember those life jackets that were used to help conceal Anna's body? DNA analysis revealed that they contained a mixture of Anna's DNA and her stepbrother's DNA. Now, you might argue that in a shared cabin, it's not unusual for family members' DNA to be on various items. But these life jackets weren't being used for their intended purpose. They weren't being worn or handled in any normal way. They were specifically positioned around Anna's body as part of the concealment, meaning someone had handled them recently and deliberately. And the DNA pattern suggested recent transfer, not old DNA from days earlier, but fresh epithelial cells that had been deposited within hours of Anna's death. The blanket that was wrapped around her body told a similar story. DNA from both Anna and her stepbrother in patterns consistent with recent handling. But the most damning evidence was what was found under Anna's fingernails. When the medical examiner collected nail scrapings during the autopsy, they found tissue and DNA that didn't belong to Anna. And when that DNA was tested and compared against samples from family members, because everyone on that cruise had voluntarily provided DNA samples to investigators, it was a match to the stepbrother, which meant that in those final moments of her life, as Anna was fighting for breath, she had clawed at her attacker. She had tried to defend herself, to push away whoever was smothering her, and in doing so, she had collected their DNA under her nails, leaving behind evidence that would point directly to her killer. This is the kind of evidence that's very difficult to explain away, because there's simply no innocent reason for the stepbrother's DNA to be under Anna's fingernails in the quantity and pattern that was found. You can't accidentally end up in that kind of intimate, violent contact with someone. And you can't claim memory loss as an excuse when your DNA is literally embedded in the victim's defensive wounds. So let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what does all of this evidence tell us? We have a timeline that places the stepbrother alone in a cabin with Anna during the exact window when she died. We have video evidence showing no one else entering or exiting that cabin during that time. We have forensic evidence, DNA on the life jackets, on the blanket, under Anna's fingernails, that ties the stepbrother directly to the crime scene and to Anna's body. We have a cause of death that requires sustained, deliberate effort to accomplish. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a sudden impulse. This was several minutes of conscious action. And we have a suspect who claims convenient amnesia about the only period of time that matters. The question now isn't really who did it anymore, is it? The question is, can prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the stepbrother is responsible for Anna's death? And will the justice system hold him accountable? Or will this case become another tragedy, where the evidence is clear, but the outcome is unsatisfying? Share this video if you think families must prioritize truth over loyalty, because only liars would protect a killer at the expense of justice for the victim. Now let's talk about something that makes this case even more complicated: the family's response to the mounting evidence against the stepbrother. Because when a crime occurs within a family, the aftermath can be just as devastating as the crime itself. Families are torn apart by conflicting loyalties, by the need to protect some members while seeking justice for others, by the impossible choice between blood ties and moral obligations. In Anna's case, her paternal grandparents, the ones who last spoke to her, who last heard her say, "I love you guys," have been caught in an impossible situation. On one hand, they lost their beloved granddaughter, a young woman they'd watched grow up, whose future they'd dreamed about, whose absence has left a hole in their lives that can never be filled. On the other hand, the person accused of taking her from them is also their grandson, the son of their son's wife, a boy they've known since he was small, someone they may have helped raise and care for. How do you reconcile those two realities? How do you grieve for one grandchild while potentially condemning another? According to sources close to the investigation, the grandparents have struggled tremendously with this conflict. In the immediate aftermath of Anna's death, before the evidence had fully emerged, they may have been inclined to believe the stepbrother's claims of innocence. They may have wanted to believe that some terrible accident had occurred, or that there was an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. But as more and more evidence came to light, the keycard logs, the CCTV footage, the DNA analysis, it became harder and harder to maintain that belief. And at some point they had to make a choice about where their loyalty would lie. Some family members have reportedly stood by the stepbrother, insisting that he deserves the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in a court of law. They've hired lawyers. They've refused to cooperate with certain aspects of the investigation. They've made statements to the media questioning the reliability of the evidence. And from a legal standpoint, they're absolutely right. Everyone deserves a fair trial. Everyone deserves competent legal representation. And the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. But from a moral standpoint, But from a human standpoint, there's something deeply troubling about a family that seems more concerned with protecting the accused than with seeking justice for the victim. Because here's the thing about family violence, it rarely happens in isolation. There are almost always warning signs, red flags that were ignored or minimized, moments when someone could have intervened but chose not to. And in the aftermath, when the worst has already happened, families often engage in what psychologists call collective denial, a shared agreement not to acknowledge what everyone on some level knows to be true. They create alternative narratives. They reinterpret evidence to fit what they want to believe. They attack the credibility of investigators or forensic experts, all because the truth is too painful to accept. In Anna's case, we've seen this dynamic play out in the conflicting statements different family members have given to investigators. Anna's father has reportedly stood by his stepson, insisting that there must be some explanation for the evidence that doesn't involve murder. Anna's stepmother, the stepbrother's biological mother, has been even more adamant in her son's defense, suggesting that investigators are rushing to judgment against a minor who can't defend himself. But Anna's grandparents have begun to see things differently as more evidence has emerged. They've started asking harder questions about the stepbrother's past behavior, about incidents that were dismissed or explained away at the time, but that now seem more sinister in hindsight. They've begun to wonder whether their desire to keep the peace in the blended family might have inadvertently put Anna in danger, whether their loyalty to their son and his new wife might have blinded them to the warning signs that Anna's friends now say were obvious. This kind of self-examination is incredibly painful. But it's also necessary if families are going to learn from tragedies like this. Because the lesson here isn't just about recognizing warning signs in the moment. It's about what we do with that recognition. It's about whether we have the courage to act on our concerns, even when acting on them might create family conflict or tension. It's about whether we prioritize the safety of vulnerable family members over the comfort of maintaining the status quo. And it's about whether we're willing to seek truth and justice even when that truth implicates someone we love. In any investigation, family dynamics can obscure the truth. This is something law enforcement officers and prosecutors deal with all the time. Witnesses become unreliable when they're emotionally invested in protecting a suspect. Evidence gets contaminated or destroyed when family members try to clean up after someone they love. Victims themselves may minimize or deny abuse because they don't want to get a family member in trouble. This is why transparency is so crucial. Why investigators need to cut through the family politics and focus solely on the evidence. Because the evidence doesn't have loyalty, it doesn't have emotional attachments. It doesn't care about keeping the peace. The evidence just tells the truth. And in Anna's case, the evidence tells a very clear truth that some members of her family may never be ready to accept. Comment your thoughts right now if you believe the truth matters more than family loyalty, because this is where we find out who really cares about justice. Now, let's talk about something that's been on everyone's mind since this case first broke. The eerie similarities between Anna Keaptainner's death and one of the most famous unsolved cases in American criminal history, the JonBenét Ramsey case. If you're not familiar with that case, let me give you the quick version. In 1996, 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado. Her death was staged to look like a kidnapping gone wrong, with a bizarre ransom note and a crime scene that investigators immediately recognized as having been contaminated and manipulated. The prime suspects were members of her own family, specifically her parents and her older brother. But despite decades of investigation and multiple grand jury proceedings, no one has ever been charged with her murder. The case remains officially unsolved, though many investigators and crime experts believe they know exactly what happened but simply can't prove it to the standard required for conviction. Now, why am I bringing up JonBenét Ramsey when we're talking about Anna Keaptainner? Because there are some striking parallels between these two cases that we need to examine. First, both involve young victims who died in a location where they should have been safe. JonBenét in her own home, Anna in her family's cruise cabin. Second, both crime scenes showed evidence of staging, attempts to make the death look like something other than what it was. Third, both cases involve family members as the primary suspects, with evidence pointing to someone who had access and opportunity, but who may never face charges. And fourth, perhaps most disturbingly, both cases involve families that seem more focused on protecting themselves than on seeking justice for the victim. In the Jean Benet case, the family's behavior immediately after her death raised red flags for investigators. The ransom note was obviously staged, written on paper from inside the home with a pen from inside the home, using language and phrasing that seemed carefully calculated. The family's statements to police were contradictory and seemed rehearsed. And family members hired expensive lawyers almost immediately before they were even formally considered suspects. Now, I want to be clear. Hiring a lawyer doesn't make you guilty, and everyone has the right to legal representation. But the optics of a family lawyering up before they've even buried their child tends to make investigators and the public question their priorities. In Anna's case, we're seeing some similar patterns emerge. The stepbrother's family has retained high-powered criminal defense attorneys who have been very aggressive in their public statements about the case. They've attacked the credibility of the investigation, suggested that evidence might have been mishandled or contaminated, and filed motions to suppress certain evidence from being used in any potential trial. Again, this is all within their legal rights, and any good defense attorney would do the same. But it creates a situation where the focus shifts from what happened to Anna to how can we poke holes in the prosecution's case. And that feels fundamentally wrong to a lot of people who are following this story, because at the end of the day, an 18-year-old woman is dead. She was murdered in a space where she should have been safe by someone who should have protected her. And instead of getting justice, instead of getting answers, we're watching a legal battle unfold where the victim's memory is being overshadowed by procedural arguments and technicalities. Could Anna's case be headed toward the same fate as Jean Benet's? A case that never fully closes, where everyone believes they know what happened, but the justice system can't quite get there? It's a terrifying possibility, but it's one we have to consider given how these cases tend to play out. In the Ramsey case, a grand jury actually voted to indict the parents, but the district attorney refused to sign the indictment, claiming there wasn't enough evidence to secure a conviction. The case technically remains open, but realistically, it's cold. Decades have passed, key witnesses have died, evidence has degraded, and the public's attention has moved on to newer tragedies. Could the same thing happen with Anna? Could we be sitting here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, talking about how obvious the answer seemed, but how the system failed to deliver justice? I hope not. I truly hope that the evidence in this case is strong enough, clear enough, and well documented enough that prosecutors can build an airtight case. But the parallels to Jean Benet are troubling, and they remind us of an important lesson about our justice system. The public's obsession with unresolved cases is often rooted in a desire for justice, for closure, for the reassurance that bad people face consequences for their actions. But in many cases, without the right evidence presented in exactly the right way to the right jury at the right time, the truth can remain hidden behind legal technicalities and reasonable doubt. And that's not necessarily a flaw in the system. The high burden of proof in criminal cases exists to protect innocent people from wrongful conviction, but it can feel deeply unsatisfying when we all know what happened and yet can't seem to get justice for the victim. Share this video right now if you agree this case has eerie similarities to Jean Benet, because we can't let history repeat itself. So where does that leave us with Anna's case? Let's look at what we know with certainty and what still remains unclear. We know with certainty that Anna died from asphyxiation in her cruise cabin on the night of November 6, 2025. We know with certainty that her stepbrother was the only person to enter and exit that cabin during the time window when she died. We know with certainty that his DNA was found on items used to conceal her body and under her fingernails. We know with certainty that he has claimed memory loss about the entire incident, and that psychiatric evaluation has raised questions about the authenticity of that claim. What we don't know with certainty is exactly what happened in those 47 minutes. Was there an argument that escalated? Did Anna confront her stepbrother about his inappropriate behavior? Did he make unwanted advances that she rejected? Or was this something darker, something premeditated, something he had been thinking about for a while. We may never know the answer to those questions unless the stepbrother decides to tell the truth. And that's the frustrating reality of cases like this. Sometimes the only person who really knows what happened is the person who did it. And if they refuse to talk or claim not to remember, we're left piecing together the story from forensic evidence and circumstantial details. But here's what I want to emphasize as we move toward the conclusion of this investigation. The case against Anna's stepbrother is strong. It's not perfect, because very few cases are, but it's strong. The timeline evidence alone would be difficult to refute. He was the only person in that room with her when she died. Add in the DNA evidence, the video footage, the behavioral observations from the psychiatric evaluation, and you have a comprehensive case that points to one clear conclusion. But whether that case is strong enough to secure a conviction, whether prosecutors feel confident enough to charge a minor with murder, knowing the scrutiny and criticism they'll face, that remains to be seen. And that's what makes this case so heartbreaking for Anna's loved ones and for everyone who's been following her story. Because we're at that excruciating point where we believe we know what happened, but we're not sure whether the system will deliver justice. Let's talk about what happens next in terms of the legal process, because a lot of people have questions about why charges haven't been filed yet. It's been 3 weeks since Anna's death, and no arrest has been made. The stepbrother was briefly detained and placed on psychiatric hold, but he was released back to his mother's custody and is currently living under supervision while the investigation continues. This might seem strange to people who watch a lot of crime dramas on TV, where arrests happen within 48 hours and cases are wrapped up in a neat bow by the end of the episode. But in reality, complex criminal cases, especially those involving minors, especially those that will face intense public scrutiny, take time to build. Prosecutors want to be absolutely certain they have every piece of evidence properly documented, every witness properly interviewed, every legal technicality addressed before they file charges. Because once you charge someone, the clock starts ticking. There are speedy trial requirements that mean you can't just take your time building the case forever. You have to be ready to go to trial within a certain time frame. And if you're not ready, the case can be dismissed. So the fact that charges haven't been filed yet doesn't necessarily mean they won't be filed. It might just mean that investigators and prosecutors are being thorough, making sure they have everything they need to secure a conviction. But I understand the frustration that Anna's family must be feeling. The grandparents who last heard her say, "I love you," and who are now waiting to see if anyone will be held accountable. The waiting is its own kind of torture, especially when you believe you know who's responsible. Especially when you have to see that person going about their daily life while your loved one is gone forever. Subscribe right now if you believe the truth is about to come out, because only manipulators would want this investigation to stall. Let me walk you through what the prosecution's case would likely look like if and when charges are filed. First, they would establish the timeline using the keycard logs and CCTV footage, demonstrating that the stepbrother had exclusive access to Anna during the time of her death. This establishes opportunity, which is one of the key elements in any murder case. They would then present the forensic evidence, the DNA on the life jackets, on the blanket, under Anna's fingernails. This establishes physical contact between the stepbrother and Anna at the time of her death, contradicting any claim that he wasn't involved. They would present the medical examiner's testimony about the cause of death, asphyxiation, requiring sustained effort over several minutes, inconsistent with accident or natural causes. This establishes that Anna's death was a homicide, not some tragic mishap. They would present expert testimony about the staged crime scene, the careful concealment of the body, the use of life jackets and blankets, the positioning of the mattress. This establishes consciousness of guilt, showing that whoever killed Anna tried to hide what they'd done, and they would present the stepbrother's behavioral evidence, his claim of memory loss, his psychiatric evaluation, his actions on the video footage after leaving the cabin. This establishes a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who knows they've done something terrible and is trying to avoid consequences. Put all of that together and you have what prosecutors call a circumstantial case. There's no eyewitness, There's no confession. There's no smoking gun. But there's a web of evidence that all points in the same direction. And when you look at all of it together, there's really only one reasonable conclusion. The defense, of course, would attack every element of this case. They would argue that the key card logs could be wrong, that someone else could have entered the cabin through other means. They would suggest that the day evidence could have been transferred innocently, that family members living in close quarters naturally share biological material. They would question the reliability of the medical examiner's findings, bringing in their own experts to suggest alternative causes of death. They would present character witnesses to testify that the stepbrother is a good kid who would never hurt anyone. And they would emphasize his age. Under 16 years old, still a minor, deserving of special consideration under the law. All of these are legitimate defense strategies, and a good attorney would use every tool available to create reasonable doubt in the jury's mind. That's how our adversarial justice system works. The prosecution presents their case, the defense pokes holes in it, and 12 jurors decide who they believe. But here's what I want you to understand about reasonable doubt. It doesn't mean absolute certainty. It doesn't mean the absence of any possible alternative explanation. It means that a reasonable person, looking at all the evidence, would be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. And in this case, when you look at the totality of the evidence, the timeline, the DNA, the behavioral evidence, the staged crime scene, can a reasonable person really doubt that the stepbrother was responsible for Anna's death? I would argue no, but that's ultimately for a jury to decide if this case ever makes it to trial. Now, let's talk about something that's been weighing on my mind throughout this investigation, the preventability of Anna's death. Because this wasn't some random act of violence by a stranger. This wasn't a case where there were no warning signs, no red flags, no opportunities for intervention. According to what we know from Anna's friends and from some family members, there were concerns about the stepbrother's behavior toward Anna long before that cruise. There were uncomfortable moments that were dismissed as teenage awkwardness or typical sibling dynamics in a blended family. There were boundary violations that Anna reportedly mentioned to friends but may not have felt comfortable discussing with her father or stepmother. And this raises a crucial question. Could Anna's death have been prevented if those early warning signs had been taken more seriously? If someone had intervened when the stepbrother first started making inappropriate comments or crossing boundaries? If the family had prioritized Anna's comfort and safety over the desire to make the blended family work? I think the answer, heartbreakingly, is yes. This tragedy could have been prevented. Not easily, not without difficult conversations and family conflict, but it could have been prevented. And that's the lesson I want you to take away from this case, because it's a lesson that could literally save a life in your own family or community. When you see warning signs of inappropriate behavior, especially behavior directed at vulnerable family members, you cannot afford to minimize or ignore those signs. You cannot prioritize peace over safety. You cannot assume that things will work themselves out or that someone else will handle it, because sometimes those early warning signs are the only opportunity you'll get to prevent something terrible from happening. Let me give you some specific red flags to watch for, because these apply not just to the Anna Keaptainner case, but to countless other situations where family violence might be brewing. First, inappropriate sexual comments or behavior from one family member toward another, especially when there's an age gap or power dynamic involved. This is never okay, and it should never be dismissed as hormones or teenage experimentation. If someone is making another family member uncomfortable with sexual comments or advances, that needs to be addressed immediately with professional intervention if necessary. Second, boundary violations, especially repeated boundary violations after someone has been told to stop. This could be entering someone's room without permission, touching someone without consent, invading someone's privacy in ways that make them uncomfortable. These might seem like small things, but they indicate a fundamental lack of respect for another person's autonomy. And that lack of respect can escalate to more serious violations. Third, possessive or controlling behavior, especially toward younger or more vulnerable family members. This might look like someone getting angry when the person they're fixated on spends time with friends, or trying to isolate that person from other relationships. or monitoring their activities in inappropriate ways. Fourth, violence or aggression toward animals, objects, or other people, even if it seems minor at the time. Research has consistently shown that people who abuse animals or who have a pattern of destroying things in anger are at higher risk of escalating to violence against people. And fifth, a sense among family members that they need to walk on eggshells around a particular person, or that addressing certain issues will cause explosive reactions. This is often a sign that someone has established a pattern of intimidation or emotional manipulation that keeps others from holding them accountable. Now, if you recognize any of these warning signs in your own family or in someone you know, what should you do? First and most importantly, take the concerns seriously, even if, especially if, they seem uncomfortable or inconvenient to address. Document specific incidents, including dates, times, and exactly what happened. This creates a record that can be useful if you need to involve authorities or mental health professionals. Second, create safety for the person who's being targeted. This might mean changing living arrangements, ensuring they were never alone with the person of concern, or providing them with resources and support to speak up about what's happening. Third, seek professional help immediately. This is not something you should try to handle on your own within the family. Contact a family therapist who specializes in these kinds of dynamics, or reach out to local domestic violence resources for guidance. If there's any immediate danger, don't hesitate to involve law enforcement. Fourth, be prepared for pushback from other family members who might want to minimize the situation or who might prioritize family unity over individual safety. Stand firm in prioritizing the vulnerable person's well-being, even if it causes conflict. And fifth, remember that patterns of concerning behavior rarely resolve on their own and almost always escalate without intervention. What seems manageable today might become dangerous tomorrow. The time to act is when you first notice the warning signs, not after something terrible has already happened. This is the lesson we can take from Anna's death, a lesson purchased at far too high a price, but one that might save someone else if we're willing to learn from it. Comment Justice for Anna. If you're committed to recognizing and acting on warning signs in your own life, because this is how we honor her memory. As we approach the conclusion of this investigation, I want to talk about what justice looks like in a case like this. Because for Anna's family, for her friends, for everyone who's been following this story, there's a very real question about whether the justice system will deliver an outcome that feels proportional to the loss. Anna was 18 years old. She was just beginning her adult life, full of dreams and potential. She wanted to go to college. She had career aspirations. She had relationships she was building and experiences she was looking forward to. All of that was stolen from her in those 47 minutes on November 6, 2012. And no conviction, no prison sentence, no legal outcome can ever restore what was taken. That's the harsh reality of these cases. True justice is impossible because we can't bring Anna back. We can't give her grandparents another chance to see her smile or hear her say, "I love you." We can't give her father another opportunity to walk her down the aisle someday or meet her children. All we can do is hold the person responsible, accountable, and try to prevent something like this from happening to another family. So what would accountability look like in this case? If the stepbrother is charged and convicted of Anna's murder, he would face sentencing as a juvenile, since he was 16 at the time of the offense, though there's a possibility prosecutors could seek to try him as an adult, given the severity of the crime. A juvenile conviction might mean he serves time in a juvenile facility until he turns 21, then potentially transfers to an adult prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence. An adult conviction could mean life in prison, though at his age there would likely be the possibility of parole at some point. Different people have different opinions about what's appropriate here. Some argue that a 16-year-old's brain is still developing, that juveniles should have the opportunity for rehabilitation, that locking someone up for life based on actions they took as a teenager is cruel and counterproductive. Others argue that this wasn't some impulsive act of a confused kid. This was sustained violence that required conscious effort to accomplish and conscious effort to conceal, and that anyone capable of that deserves to be treated as an adult regardless of their age. I'm not here to tell you which perspective is right, because that's a question for judges and juries and lawmakers to grapple with. What I will say is this: whatever the outcome, Anna's family deserves to see her killer held accountable. They deserve to be able to tell their daughters, their granddaughters, their sister's story without fear of defamation lawsuits or family retaliation. They deserve to know that the justice system took Anna's death seriously and pursued every avenue to establish the truth. And Anna herself, wherever her spirit may be now, deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered, whose life had value, whose loss created a hole in the world that can never be filled. That's what justice looks like in these cases. Not perfect restoration, because that's impossible, but acknowledgement, accountability, and a commitment to doing better. Let me take a moment here to address something that's been coming up in the comments and discussions around this case. Some people have asked why I'm so focused on the stepbrother when the investigation is technically still ongoing and no charges have been filed. They argue that we should presume innocence until proven guilty, that rushing to judgment based on circumstantial evidence is dangerous, that I'm potentially prejudicing a jury pool if this case ever goes to trial. And look, those are fair concerns in principle. Our justice system is built on the presumption of innocence, and that's a good thing. We don't want to live in a society where people can be convicted by social media before they ever see the inside of a courtroom. But here's the thing: I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not a judge, and I'm not a juror. I'm a storyteller, and my job is to look at the available evidence and help people understand what that evidence suggests. And in this case, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests one clear conclusion. That doesn't mean I'm declaring him guilty with the authority of a court of law. It means I'm looking at the timeline, the forensic evidence, the behavioral evidence, and the circumstantial details. And I'm drawing the conclusion that any reasonable person would draw. If new evidence emerges that changes that conclusion, I'll be the first to update this analysis. But until then, I'm going to continue focusing on the person who all available evidence points toward, because Anna deserves to have her story told, and part of telling that story honestly means acknowledging what the evidence shows. If you've made it this far in this investigation, nearly 2 hours of detailed analysis, you clearly care about finding the truth. So here's what I need you to do. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because I'll be following this case as it develops. When charges are filed, when a trial date is set, when a verdict is reached, I'll be here to break it all down for you. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Like this video to help it reach more people who care about justice for Anna, and share it with anyone you think needs to hear this story, because Anna's case matters not just for her family, but for all the families out there dealing with similar dynamics and warning signs. Comment below with your thoughts. I read every single comment, and I want to hear what you think about this case. Do you believe the evidence is strong enough for a conviction? Do you think justice will be served? What lessons do you think we should take away from Anna's story? Let's keep this conversation going, because that's how we honor Anna's memory. By refusing to let her story be forgotten, by demanding accountability, and by learning from this tragedy so we can protect others. As we wrap up this investigation, I want to leave you with 5 key lessons that I hope you'll carry with you long after you finish watching this video. These are lessons that could save a life, maybe even someone in your own family. Lesson 1. Recognize red flags in behavior, especially behavior that makes vulnerable family members uncomfortable. Don't minimize, don't make excuses, don't assume it will work itself out. Those early warning signs are your opportunity to intervene before something tragic happens. Lesson 2. Family transparency is essential, even when it's uncomfortable. Secrets and silence enable abusers and put victims at risk. Create a family culture where people feel safe speaking up about concerning behavior, where loyalty to the family means protecting its most vulnerable members, not protecting those who threaten them. Lesson 3. When you notice troubling behavior, intervene immediately with professional help. This is not something you can fix with a stern talking to or by hoping the person will grow out of it. Get therapists involved, get counselors involved, and if necessary, get law enforcement involved. Lesson 4. Keep a safe environment for children and vulnerable family members. This means not forcing them into situations where they're alone with people who make them uncomfortable, not dismissing their concerns as drama or oversensitivity, and not prioritizing family unity over individual safety. Your job as a parent, as a grandparent, as an older family member is to protect those who can't fully protect themselves. Lesson 5. Leverage technology and evidence to expose the truth. In Anna's case, the keycard logs and CCTV footage were crucial in establishing what happened. In your own life, don't be afraid to document concerning behavior, to save text messages or emails that show a pattern of inappropriate conduct, to create a record that can be used if intervention becomes necessary. These 5 lessons won't bring Anna back. They won't undo the tragedy that occurred on the Carnival Horizon on November 6, 2025. But they might, just might, prevent another family from experiencing the same devastating loss. And if we can learn from Anna's death, if we can take these lessons and apply them to protect others, then her story will have meaning beyond the tragedy itself. Anna Keaptainner should be alive today. She should be preparing for her first semester of college, hanging out with friends, planning her future. She should be calling her grandmother to say, "I love you," and hearing those words back. She should be here. And the fact that she's not, the fact that her life was cut short by someone who should have protected our grandmother, is a failure that extends beyond just the person who killed her. It's a failure of the systems that should have recognized warning signs earlier. It's a failure of the family dynamics that may have enabled concerning behavior to escalate unchecked. It's a failure of a culture that sometimes prioritizes family harmony over individual safety. And it's a failure that we all have a responsibility to learn from and to prevent from happening again. So as we wait for the justice system to do its work, as we wait for charges to be filed, for trials to be held, for verdicts to be reached, let's not lose sight of what this case is really about. It's not about true crime entertainment or social media drama or our fascination with murder mysteries. It's about a young woman whose life mattered, whose death was senseless and preventable, and whose memory deserves to be honored with action. Action in the form of better protection for vulnerable family members. Action in the form of earlier intervention when warning signs appear. Action in the form of families that prioritize truth and safety over the appearance of unity. Action in the form of a justice system that holds people accountable regardless of their age or their family connections. That's how we honor Anna, not just with words, but with meaningful change. The investigation into Anna Keaptainner's death continues. Detectives are still conducting interviews. Forensic analysts are still processing evidence. Prosecutors are still building their case. And somewhere, the person responsible for taking Anna's life is going about their daily routine, perhaps hoping that enough time will pass that people will forget, that the evidence will become less compelling, that they'll escape accountability. But we won't forget. Anna's family won't forget. And when the time comes for justice to be served, we'll be watching to make sure it happens. Thank you for spending these 2 hours with me, diving deep into Anna's case, examining the evidence, and thinking critically about the lessons we can learn. If you found value in this investigation, if you believe Anna's story needed to be told, show your support by subscribing to this channel right now. Hit that bell icon so you're notified the moment there's a significant development in this case. Like this video to help it reach more people who care about justice. Share it with your family and friends, because these lessons about recognizing warning signs and protecting vulnerable people apply to all of us. And comment below with your thoughts. I want to hear from you about what stood out to you in this case, what lessons you are taking away, and what you think should happen next. Let's keep Anna's story alive. Let's keep demanding justice. And let's make sure that her death, as tragic and senseless as it was, leads to real change that protects others. Because that's the only way we can create meaning from tragedy. That's the only way we can honor Anna's memory. And that's the only way we can look her grandmother in the eye and tell her that her granddaughter's death wasn't in vain. Rest in peace, Anna Keaptainner. Your story has been told, your life has been honored, and your fight for justice continues. Until next time, stay vigilant, protect your loved ones, and never stop demanding truth. This has been the shocking death of Anna Keaptainner, family secrets, hidden truths, and the ongoing search for justice.